This video was brought to you by Squarespace. Move over. Originally, this video was going to be a simple, casual review of Donkey Kong Country Returns HD. And you know, I guess it still kind of can be. I mean, sure, why not? Let's do the review part first. There's not really a ton to say about the game. DKCR was an exciting return to side-scrolling DK when it first came out. I played the 3DS version, and, you know, I had a really great time with it. I loved it. Whatever version you're playing, I think it's a really solid modernization that introduces some great new elements and really utilizes 3D hardware. The SNES games were already feasts for the eyes, and this one does a great job living up to that legacy with its expressive characters and enemies and its epic and lively set pieces. It doesn't exactly capture the mood of the SNES games, but I don't even know if that's possible. That mood came down to a particular mix of visual and musical styles that you're just not gonna get without those old hardware limitations. Returns is a really great time though, and certainly one of the better 2D platformers I have played. If it's got anything going against it, it's that the sequel, Tropical Freeze, was just so much better. That game took the experience and trimmed away the parts that weren't quite working, improved what was left, and then added even more on top of that. That game is definitively the best 2D platformer I have ever played. So going back to DKCR for the first time since playing Tropical Freeze and, you know, endlessly singing its praises, I can definitely see the flaws a little more clearly. It's just not as refined an experience. You know, the design isn't quite on the same level. And you know what? I didn't mind blowing on flowers and stuff before, but apparently I'm really sick of it now. It's a funny thing to count against the quality of the game, but it really does give you way too much stuff to blow on, and that has a pretty dramatic impact on the pacing if you want to make sure you don't miss any secrets. Overall though, Donkey Kong Country Returns is a good game, and it's certainly nice to have a somewhat modernized version playable on more or less modern hardware. This one's got all the tweaks and extra content from the 3DS version, including an easier mode where you get more hearts, which I certainly appreciate. I mean, it's a fun Nintendo game. There is no denying that. But to get to the real point of the video, in a vacuum, Returns HD is fine, and it's hard to complain too much. As a remaster, however, it leaves a lot to be desired. Like, a lot. The game certainly looks better than the Wii version for the most part. Models and textures have been sharpened up, smoothed over a bit. It runs at a higher resolution. That's very much a true statement. It is, by definition, a high-definition game, which at this point is probably not as much of a selling point as Nintendo seems to think that it is, considering 4K, or at least close to it, has more or less been the standard for the better part of a decade. I mean, I suppose I'm happy that it does at least hit that 1080p docked 720p handheld ceiling. The image is relatively sharp, all things considered, and I do understand to a point that Nintendo might not feel like adding a whole bunch of extra content to a game that they already beefed up once. DKCR 3D added content and tweaks, making it the definitive version of the game. Why bother adding even more if you don't have to? I get that from their perspective, it made a lot more sense to just pretty the thing up and sell it again so people could access it more easily without buying old hardware. And obviously I'm all for that idea for the most part. You know, bringing things forward is pretty much always a good idea, whatever form they take. It just means more games. It means more people playing old games that they might not have been around for or might have missed. Hold on a sec, hold on. Has anyone seen my vegetable peeler? I can't seem to find it. Oh well, while we're here though, I might as well remind you that this video was brought to you by Squarespace. Do you need a simple blog-style website like my site, Arlo Recommends? Or perhaps do you need more, like a full-blown storefront, or a place to host free or paid content for your followers, or some other thing? Whatever the case, Squarespace makes it easy. Their intuitive builder makes formatting and adding and tweaking anything and everything a snap. Doesn't matter if you have literally zero experience with any of this stuff, because it can all be done without writing a single line of code. If you want to supercharge your site, Squarespace offers lots of powerful extensions, as well as a really convenient suite of analytics so you can always keep up to date on how your site is doing. To try out Squarespace for yourself, head to squarespace.com for a free trial. Then when you're ready to launch, head to squarespace.com/Arlo to save 10% off your first website or domain. And now for today's recommendation, Flawed Mangoes. He does really cool music with really cool visuals, and he hosts a 24/7 live stream that plays all of it, and it makes for some really excellent background vibes for pretty much anything. Thanks again to Squarespace. Oh, there's my peeler. I'm gonna go, peel some stuff now. The problem with this particular remaster, though, is that it feels like it could have used a little bit more remastering, you know? Like they could have just put a little bit more juice in the remaster machine or something. There's just this feeling of cheapness about the whole thing. Some elements have clearly been replaced with higher res versions, yet they fail to mesh properly with the rest of the visuals. Most of it does look better, but it really doesn't look that much better. It's just a little surprising that you can rip open a game's code and remake or polish most of the assets and end up with a remaster that barely seems like an improvement at all unless you hold both old and new games side by side. I've seen people argue that some elements actually look worse. I'm still a little torn on that idea, personally. I think much of the pre-release "is it actually worse" discourse was a bit sensational. I also think it comes down to the individual artistic choices of the art team. It's easy to see some of these details as being bad when in reality they're just kind of different. I'm not too fussed about, like, shadows in a cutscene changing, for instance. But hey, this stuff is also pretty subjective, and I guess the fact that we're having this conversation at all, you know, holding a magnifying glass to these tiny little changes and trying to figure out how they compare might say something about how unimpressive overall this remaster is. Assuming the art style hasn't been changed dramatically, which it definitely hasn't here, we probably should be more or less in agreement that a remaster is clearly better in every way over the original. But when it comes to Returns HD, we're not. Because even looking at it more broadly and objectively, it just really hasn't been changed all that much. And even if I'm not gonna make a blanket statement like, they made the game look worse, I do think some of these visual elements lack cohesion. Many of them still kind of stand out as looking a little iffy, even though this is supposed to be nothing but an improvement over a game produced for much, much older hardware. If you took the time to redo an asset or an effect, why wouldn't it look a lot better than this? I'll admit, one big problem here is that Tropical Freeze also had a re-release on Switch, and that game looks loads better. But it was also a generation newer than DKCR originally, so by default, of course it looks a heck of a lot better. Nintendo would have to do a lot more work to get this game looking that good. And in a situation like this, where you've got a beloved but not crazy popular game that most agree has been outclassed by its follow-up, releasing as it has on hardware that is modern yet still aging and on its way out, they didn't want to do any more work than they absolutely had to. And, you know, I think if this remaster was seen only as a disappointingly bare minimum effort, it wouldn't be so bad. Luigi's Mansion 2 HD also felt very bare minimum. These two games, releasing near the end of the generation, are two peas in a pod, really. The original versions were very well received and are still beloved by many, but through a modern lens, they're seen now as the not quite as good kind of in-between games that are overshadowed by what came both before and after. Just as the original Luigi's Mansion is generally seen as a much more important game than 2, and everything 2 did was dramatically improved upon in 3, the original DKC trilogy is a beloved, even seminal collection of classic platformers, and Tropical Freeze is everything Returns was and better. Returns and Dark Moon are two great games sandwiched between even greater ones, both once representing triumphant returns to long dormant series, and now bumped a surprising number of rungs down the ladder due to simple comparison. Considering how similar these two cases are, it shouldn't be surprising how similarly they were handled. Two fast, easy remasters meant to make a quick buck, please fans looking for an easier way to play them, and maybe even hit the folks who haven't had a chance to play them yet. Shockingly plain compared to the likes of some of Nintendo's other re-releases, as I talked about in my video on this whole subject, but somewhat understandable, if a little disappointing. Nintendo knew these two games weren't gonna do gangbusters, so they figured they'd go with a high price so they could make some extra money from the small, loyal crowd who were gonna buy anyway. I could certainly argue that this is what makes the games particularly hard to swallow. The games are less important, so let's put less effort into them and charge more because we know fewer people will buy them. So now we've got products that are double or even triple bad value propositions, depending on how you look at it. But the price is almost beside the point. It is a part of the conversation, sure, but even more important is the way Luigi's Mansion 2 HD and DKCR HD, as similar as they are, actually differ. The biggest problem with DKCR HD is that it's not simply as boring and safe and low effort as Luigi's Mansion 2 HD. I'd say effort-wise, or rather quality-wise, it's actually a smidge lower. And when you're delivering the bare minimum, you better at the very least deliver the bare minimum. But in this case, it seems like we've gotten slightly less than that. Again, the game's visual merits are somewhat arguable, but then there are other issues as well. The frame rate dips here and there, particularly in cutscenes. Nothing crazy, nothing that majorly affects the gameplay, but it's noticeable. And the load times are actually quite significant, especially compared to Tropical Freeze. In the grand scheme of things, a few dropped frames and a few added seconds of wait time aren't the end of the world, but you can't deny that they're a little weird coming from a rather old game running on much stronger hardware. Why does this older game that looks significantly worse than its modern counterpart also run worse without any major graphical enhancements? It could be argued that the Thousand Year Door remake also runs worse, considering the frame rate has been cut in half, but that game's visuals were also completely redone, putting it on the same level as modern titles. It looks incredible. The lower frame rate was required to allow for all these fancy effects. In DK's case, though, the performance dips don't seem to be justified at all. The uneven performance combined with the uneven visual upgrade suggests to me, quite simply, a lower quality product. A product that is simply worse than its contemporaries. And it's understandable for one game to have a lower or higher budget than another. It's normal to feel like different games offer different amounts of value. It's just the way of things. But Nintendo wants us to believe that all their products are of a certain level of quality. And DKCR HD feels like it is below their usual quality standard. It's actually less than their usual bare minimum. To get to the real heart of the matter, the reason I'm doing this instead of just a simple review of this game, we're talking about DK here. We're not talking about some obscure little series. This is DK. DK games don't sell quite as well as Mario games, sure. There isn't quite as much interest in the series as there maybe used to be. But like, DK! He's the OG Nintendo character. He's practically Miyamoto's firstborn. After Mario, he is the most recognizable Nintendo guy. People of every age have been exposed to his games. Out of all possible Mario movie spin-offs, a DK movie is the one that I'm like certain would work for general audiences. They just installed a DK park at Super Nintendo World, for Pete's sake. The guy's literally got his own theme park now. It's already weird that he hasn't gotten more games over the years. It's already weird that this re-release is the first mainline DK game to drop in 6 years, and the one before it was also a re-release. Tropical Freeze was the last original DK game, and it came out over 10 years ago. There wasn't too much of a gap between Returns and Tropical Freeze, but then we had to wait 11 years between 64 and Returns. I don't know why we don't get more DK. Maybe it has to do with Miyamoto's overly cautious and protective nature when it comes to the IPs he helped pioneer. But whatever the case though, it puts a lot more importance on each release in my eyes. And right now, considering this could have been something of a new DK renaissance between the Mario movie and the theme park, this was not the time to give us an uncharacteristically subpar remaster experience. This was not the time to give us a ho-hum who cares DK game. Considering both the current context and the character's legacy, it just feels wrong. Maybe this is just me letting my blood get all angried up about a cartoon gorilla, but I do think this is probably the saddest re-release Nintendo has ever published. I could be wrong, maybe I'm missing something here, but even among their safer, lower effort ports and remasters, I don't think anything else has slipped quite this low below the bar. Those lower effort end of generation 3DS re-releases we're always dunking on, they were in the same situation. I'm guessing they also had pretty small budgets, at least compared to new projects. They were dumped onto the system right at the end of its life and then promptly forgotten. But you know what? Even those games seem to have had a lot more put into them than this. They were fairly unnecessary re-releases, but they were still good re-releases. A Luigi's Mansion remaster was wasted on such a small, fuzzy screen in my opinion, but they still did a lot to gloss everything up, and they even added a whole new co-op mode. That's crazy. Yoshi and Poochie's Woolly World did lose a couple small features, but also gained some new ones along with new levels. We got not one, but two complete remakes of classic Mario and Luigi games. These were not exciting products, nor were they popular products, but they were quality products nonetheless. Comparatively, DKCR HD is not really a quality product. I really do think it might be the worst remaster slash remake slash enhanced port they've done. If there's any game that might take the worst re-release crown over it, in my eyes, it's Pokemon Brilliant Diamond and Shining Pearl. I will still be ranting about that game on my deathbed. It insulted me so. But even if that game's only a fraction of what it should have been, and looked embarrassingly bad for a Switch game, I don't think I can say it looked worse than the original, right? It was technically an upgrade over the DS version in most areas, battles especially. It did lack the content from Platinum, so one might consider it a downgrade, but it wasn't a remake of Platinum, was it? It should have been, but it wasn't. I guess I'm having a hard time judging which is a more disappointing re-release between Pokemon and DK. Pokemon is more infuriating, considering how little it improved upon such an old pair of handheld games, and especially considering how much money we all knew it would make. But if we're being technical, it still probably improved the most over the original versus DKCR and its barely remastered remaster? I don't know. Either way though, it's a close race from where I'm standing, and that's saying something. I don't want to be too sensational about DKCR HD. The game's still not bad, especially compared to other disastrous re-releases from other companies in recent years. Nintendo's standard is clearly still much higher than it could be. But they gave this job to a team with a really spotty track record. Forever Entertainment does not have the best reputation, yet Nintendo entrusted our beloved ape to them above all others, and they apparently ported the game in Unity, which I hear comes with big limitations. This made for a game that looks good, but not great, and runs fine, but not great. And Nintendo released the game the same day they announced the stinkin' Switch 2, with a $60 price tag and without crediting any of the original developers, just to add insult to injury. At a time when we should be celebrating the character, Nintendo tossed out a DK game that they clearly care very little about. The most casual, low-effort re-release you could imagine coming from the company. Very possibly the worst re-release they've ever done, actually. And I just think that's kinda sad. It's really not a good look for Nintendo, and it's a wasted opportunity to do more with DK. All that said, though, and I'm speaking directly to Nintendo now, all that said, If you give us a new 3D DK game on Switch 2, all of this will be completely forgiven forever, and I will never say anything bad about you ever again.